Welcome everybody, J Beam and J Savitri. My name is Thenmozhi Soundararajan and I'm Executive Director of Equality Labs. And it is my pleasure to be able to host this wonderful fireside chat with our colleagues Safiya Noble and Sasha Costanza Chock. And, I think before we begin this panel, I just want everybody to take a little time to settle. I know that, the moment that we're coming in, which is year 2 of this pandemic, has really just run havoc for all of us. And even if this is one of the last things that you do today, I know that there's about 1.5 years of hell that we've survived. Many people have lost really deep and powerful losses to the pandemic. And many of the activists that are here from RightsCon are also attending while their democracies are under attack from digital authoritarianism. And so we know how hard it is to show up, how hard it is to be present when we are also carrying the losses of so many. And so before we begin, I just want you to settle in, get comfortable into your couch. You're entering a chat with some of your best friends about some of the things that we care the most about when we're talking about digital authoritarianism and bias in these platforms. But I want you to be able to be embodied. So if you can just take a breath, settle in, and think about the fact that we're just going to spend an hour together and think about freedom. And as we think about that, bringing all those that we've lost with us so that we can hold them as we work forward into this conversation with grace. So thank you. And again, we're about to go into our panel. And, I'd like to welcome Professor Safiya Noble, who is the author of Algorithms of Oppression, and Professor Costanza Chock, who is the author of Design Justice, Community-Led Practices to Build the World That We Need. And, today's conversation is really meant to be a thoughtful reflection at the face of all of these crises, how we can begin to start to put our attention from documenting the problem into imagining the solution. And I think that, our two colleagues here are some of the best people to riff on that idea with me, because they are folks who have really helped to build this field and push the field beyond the constraints that, surveillance capitalism would not allow us to talk about many of these issues. And with Professor Noble's work, it's a really important reminder how women of color and femmes of color were the Cassandras, as well as the canaries in the coal mine of what was happening with these technical platforms, and people did not listen. Imagine if we had the wide-scale societal understanding and the interest to move on the issues of algorithmic bias in 2018, when Professor Noble's book first dropped, as opposed to in 2021, after a near coup took down American democracy. Right. So I want to first bring in Professor Noble, and, Safiya, if you didn't mind doing like an intro that you feel like would be helpful for people to understand where you're coming from in this conversation. I'm just wondering, for folks who are familiar with your work, or for people that are in democracies that are facing crisis because of the interventions of these colonial platforms, I'm just wondering what your thoughts are, at this moment in times of the openings that you see, because I think people definitely see the problems, but I think that sometimes, diagnosing and documenting the problem leads people to a place of despair. So I'm wondering, where is the hope in what you're seeing?
Thank you so much for that just incredible framing, and I consider it such an honor to get to be in conversation with the two of you tonight. So I just want to say that I'm joining you tonight from the Gabrielino and Tonga people's land, which they have not ceded, where I work and live in Los Angeles. And I am really moved by the way that you started us as well, with a kind of a centering and a grounding in these conversations, because I think, as is the practice of many of our communities, to be present and to pay attention and to see and to connect across generations, the conditions that our communities are facing is one of the most important entry points into these conversations that we can have. And it is also a practice and a way of intervening into these conversations we're going to have tonight. So I started this work myself thinking about where I was in kind of a very local experience of living in the United States, working in corporate America. I spent 15 years working in advertising and marketing, and then I went back to graduate school during the recession at a time when not only were my friends and colleagues, all of us, in despair financially because of what the recession was doing to our lives and to our networks. But I, kind of entered these conversations at a time when companies like Google and Facebook were emerging powerfully into the zeitgeist in the United States. And I was interested in questions like, how do we disambiguate knowledge and wisdom from advertising or propaganda? That really is what, like, the kinds of questions that I had when I entered this conversation. And I saw so many people were turning to Google search to help them answer complex questions that was, akin to, I don't know, opening the pages of Vogue magazine or something, or opening the pages of the Inquirer. I mean, opening up a media space that was completely driven by advertising, where there might be some good nuggets, but for the most part, turning away from long forms of like oral tradition and knowledge systems and libraries and other universities, other kinds of sites of expertise to move our societies forward. People were turning to these advertising platforms instead. And that's what brought me to the conversation. And so even though the book eventually came out in 2018, it was really in 2010 that I started documenting systematically the way in which communities of color, women and girls of color in particular, were so profoundly misrepresented in something like a large-scale commercial advertising platform like Google Search. And of course, one of the things that we know is that people who don't have contact or relationship with our communities, in my case, in the Black community, derive their understandings about the world from the media that they consume. And the media serves as a proxy for authentic relationship. And this is one of the reasons why for 50 years, more than 50 years, going back all the way to Du Bois documenting and taking photographs of African Americans in the United States and putting those images out in direct opposition to the way in which the scientific community was portraying Black people as scientific subjects of inferiority. There's been a long history of understanding that the type of media that people experience is often used in incredibly dehumanizing ways for oppressed people. Part of the project of oppression is to misrepresent and dehumanize people. And that, of course, allows for people to not only not be held accountable for acts of dehumanization because they become so profoundly normalized, but also to legislate and organize economies in direct opposition to oppressed people. So I was thinking about this in the context of something like Google and eventually, of course, social media, thinking about Facebook, and how that practice and that project of dehumanization, that we could go all the way back to early science. We could look at Hollywood with the kind of first blockbuster film, Birth of a Nation, which is one of the, like, a racist KKK propaganda film, all the way to the way in which Black girls and women were represented with pornography as a primary representation in Google search when you looked for us. all those practices are actually part of a systematic way of disenfranchising and legitimating the disenfranchisement, and in some cases, in the most extreme cases, the genocide and extermination of people around the world. And so that documentation is very important, but also making these historical linkages so that we understand that things like racist propaganda are actually not new, and they didn't get invented in social media. Like the proliferation of that, our communities have been engaged in resisting that kind of dehumanization for as long as we've been in contact with people who would seek to colonize our communities. So that's how I entered this conversation, is kind of at the space and place of my own experience. And of course, here we are. It's been more than a decade of doing this kind of research and thinking about this. And now, of course, I feel so much more hopeful, because when I was first talking about this in 2010, people would tell me, this is not a thing. What you're talking about, technology cannot discriminate, because technology is ultimately just computer code, and computer code is just math, and math can't be racist, math can't be sexist, math can't oppress. And of course, this is a ludicrous formulation. I thought it was ludicrous then, but now most of us understand, that are interested in following what big technology companies are doing, and also not brand name technology companies like Palantir and other types of surveillance technologies. So maybe that's just kind of like a way to enter and situate how I am interested in these conversations. Ultimately, to me, I would say what I'm most hopeful about is that not only is this fantastic conference, RightsCon, giving us an opportunity to talk openly and frankly about the escalating global inequality, the profound economic inequality that is around us, and that the tech industry is also implicated in exacerbating, but that we are truly on the precipice of watching the real-time collapse of modern liberal democracies around the world. And who's paying the price are the most oppressed people in those countries. And I think that we have to keep our eye on the prize here of thinking about what's possible, how might we reimagine the future, as we always have, because it has been about reimagining the end of the transatlantic slave trade, or keeping our eye on imagining the end of chattel slavery, or the end of Jim Crow. I mean, these are things that are specific to my family's history in the United States, but I think these are it's in our imagining our way out of those things that we can remember there's a lot we can be doing now to imagine a future that is not organized the way we're organized today.
I think that's so important, because what you're saying, because I think that, I felt so often that in the way that you created space through Black feminist scholarship for what it meant to apply the politics of intersectionality to better understand the structural and implicit bias of these tech structures and the company cultures of big tech was so critical, I think, for other marginalized communities. And, in my context, like when we're talking about decolonization, we actually first start with this idea of de-Brahmanization, which is that we're looking at the foundations of structural exclusion in the subcontinent being grounded in the violent system of caste. And, it's completely expected that if you have a system of oppression that is thousands of years old, that would find itself to digitize and make itself into the culture of the tech that we start to use, because all tech is a tool. Tech is not a utopian vision. Tech is not going to bring forth the next era. Tech is simply a tool by the people that design it. And I think what's so profound about, some of the things that you said is that I feel that in some ways, like when people put, theorists of color and queer theorists and theorists from the global south into a Cassandra position where we're seeing the problems from being the victims of the problems, or from, experiencing the structural exclusion that comes from those problems, as opposed to opening us up to be the solution makers, the co-designers that can break through flawed business models, that can break through the questions of bias. What happens is that we become the testing ground for violent systems that end up upending all of society. And this is so poignant in the subcontinent because, for many people here that are of Indian descent, we are in a time of digital genocide. What we saw in the conditions of India was because of companies like Facebook, who entered the market, around 2011, and they had their first mass atrocity in India in 2013. Instead of them stopping operations and doing a human rights audit assessment or talking about what happened,
Thenmozhi, you froze for a moment. At a really crucial moment, we were talking about 2013. Facebook amplified mass murders that were happening, and Facebook's inability to learn from that moment by proactively doing a human rights audit or assessment, and then shifting practices from that.
Hey guys, I'm back. Are you guys able to hear me?
Yes.
we are.
Okay, thank you guys. Live in process. This is Microsoft Teams.
Okay.
So in any case, I think the thing that was so intense was, in the face of that massive failure, they leaned into this process and they basically polarized the environment, so much so that in the beginning of 2019, we saw the Citizenship Amendment Act pass in India, which basically opened the stage for the largest genocidal project in world history. And that's what we were dealing with before the pandemic hit. So these questions of how we build hope in the face of increased polarization and structural bias in the technology that we use that abets this, the erosion of democracy is so critical. And I find that so many of the activists and the community of RightsCon are so effective at documenting the problem. If you talk to any of the folks here, many of them have spent hours and hours and hours, have spent years developing data sets to try to move these companies to do the right thing. And what we're doing is often documenting our own demise, because we're invested to document the problem, but not to build the solutions. And Sasha, I would love to bring your voice into this conversation, particularly with the work that you've done in terms of thinking about vision at the point of violence, especially with your work around design justice. And I'm wondering if you could speak to how do we start to move beyond the paralysis that comes from the violence that we're experiencing into creating and designing around hope.
Thanks, Thenmozhi. And yeah, it's such a pleasure to be in conversation with you and with Safiya. I want to also begin with a land acknowledgement. So I'm living and working on the unceded lands of the Massachusetts, the Pawtucket, and the Wampanoag peoples in the Boston area. And I think that question about how do we reimagine our techno-social futures through a lens of hope, even as we're busy documenting our own erasure, is a really difficult one. I would say I would reach back to some of the work that actually led me and you to first encounter each other, Thenmozhi. So back around 2003, 2004, when the Indie Media Network was still going really strong. So Indie Media was a transnational network of people using free software to create kind of DIY news network for self-documenting the social movements of the time, in particular the global justice movement or the anti-corporate globalization movement that was highly inspired by the Zapatista movement in southern Mexico and by Subcomandante Marcos's invitation for us to create a world where many worlds could fit and to create a sort of international communication network to tell our own stories. So we met during that time as kind of activists and hackers, many of whom came from an anti-authoritarian left tradition, but also linked to indigenous rights movements, linked to the labor movement, linked to environmental movements, and others were organizing to figure out how we could use this tool that kind of seemed new at the time, that not a lot of people had access to. But the net became something where we started to say, well, we could document our stories, we could document those struggles, we could circulate those struggles more rapidly. And we thought that we could jump around or between the cracks of the broadcast and print media, of the time. And there were a lot of beautiful things that happened during that time. There were a lot of connections that were made. There were a lot of networks of people more than anything else, more than the tools or the technologies that we created together, because those didn't necessarily last. The open publishing sites that we innovated at the time quickly became obsolete, or they became captured or appropriated by venture capitalists who figured out how to turn them into profitable platforms funded by ad dollars and by packaging consumer eyeballs and through the model that we now talk about as surveillance capitalism. But we created a lot of those things. We created a lot of those tools, and then they were taken from us, because that's the cycle of capitalist appropriation of community-led innovation that operates not only in the media and information sector, but it actually operates everywhere. The history of capitalism is the history of people taking and owning human beings and bodies and chattel slavery, and taking and owning the earth and the land, and displacing and committing genocide upon indigenous peoples to take control, and taking and owning ideas and turning them into something that's profitable only for those who already have access to capital. So again, just sort of locating that history of community-led socio-technical innovation that actually generated these ideas that came to be known as social media, came to be known as the platforms that we're all using now. Want to locate that within that much larger history of a system that literally is about appropriating people's labor, time, and bodies, as well as the planet Earth, and destroying all of those things in the service of an abstracted idea that then lets people who exist at intersections or in bodies that have structural privilege get more access, and everyone else gets less. So we were creating all of these things. There's a great story actually in the in my book Design Justice. I talk about different versions of the origins of Twitter and the corporate PR version of that origin story, which is that Jack Dorsey is sitting on a swing looking into a blue sky and suddenly has a brilliant flash of brilliance, and then creates this this platform, versus other stories about how Twitter came to be that include the prehistory of the free open source project TextMob that was created for activists to better coordinate using group text messaging to help do direct action and shut down street intersections in New York City during the Republican National Convention, and how TextMob became sort of demo design for what would later become Twitter. So we see that over and over and over again if we look back through the history of technology and of media technology and of social media in particular. Another great example of that would be Signal, and the emergence of end-to-end encrypted messaging as something that really came out of anarchist hacker networks, and then the protocol gets adopted by WhatsApp and suddenly is available to over 1 billion people at the time. Of course, WhatsApp still shares metadata, so that's one of the most important aspects of what the surveillance state likes to do, and the surveillance state linked to capitalist companies. They work hand in hand, and the metadata about who's talking to who and when and for how long is in a lot of ways what they need to track the both for targeted ads, but also for targeted drones, right? So I also think we want to not decouple the conversation about tracking and targeting from the relevance of the understanding of sort of sophisticated surveillance apparatus of the continued project of US military empire, military bases around the world, targeted assassinations and drone strikes, systematic death on Black and brown bodies in order to maintain the world petroleum economy. These things are not separate, they're linked. The same firms develop them. Microsoft Azure has the cloud contract for the Department of Defense, and so on and so on and so forth. But in the midst of all of that, even as we create these new tools and they emerge from movement spaces and from community spaces, just as much as they emerge from academic institutions or research sites or corporate R&D departments, there's a cycle where we generate and create, and then there's appropriation that happens, and then we come up with new possibilities, and we find new workarounds, and we hack new possible modes of interacting with one another and of creating and sharing media. So I see hope in the fact that there's constant creation and creativity and innovation that's happening at the sites of the most marginalization and oppression. There's always resistance, and there's, wherever in the Allied Media Projects Network and in the Allied Media Conference Network, we always talk about how, wherever people are facing oppression, people are always also already creating solutions. And I think that applies in the tech space as well. So that's how I think about that. There's always hope and cracks and new innovations emerging around the edges, even as those are always being scooped up and repackaged and resold back to people. But that process is never done, because the power of capital to take on and take over and profit from the creations of marginalized communities is never greater than the power of human beings to imagine new possible worlds.
And I think that's such a powerful and place to really move this conversation into, because I think, as you have really kind of helped to remind our audience, in many ways the artifacts from community technology is both the innovations in terms of process and visioning around these violent frontiers, and the products. And sometimes the products stay, and sometimes they get lost, but the possibilities of the process are actually the lineages we need to be able to imagine ourselves out of this particular moment. And, I think that, Safiya, in bringing this, conversation back to you, I think that when we are looking at so much of the structural exclusion that's built into these algorithms, particularly in the ways that people are starting to bring this conversation into AI and the whole ethical AI model that people are talking about, in many ways, I feel that people are falling into a trap of wanting to accept the neoliberal half solution, as opposed to accepting what is the truly visionary option here. And I'm wondering if you could speak to that, particularly because I think there's a lot of people who are listening who are allies internal to these institutions, because institutions, whether it's big tech or intergovernmental organizations or venture capital institutions, which are part of this business model that is wrong. These aren't just like big buildings. There are people, and not all of those people are ideologically aligned. And sometimes all they need is a spark to think differently, to open up to a greater liberatory possibility. And so I'm wondering, Safiya, if you could help break down what is wrong about this model, but also what are the visionary options that we have out of this?
Yeah, I love this framing, because that's actually the historical frame that we need, which is to remember that for every social movement for justice around the world, there was the person who made some sandwiches. There was a person who let an activist sleep on their couch. There was a person who gave somebody a ride someplace. So everybody can really play an important part And it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be writing a book or that you're going to be on the front lines as an organizer always either. And this is one of the reasons why we study the civil rights movement and other power-based movements, because we have to understand that we actually do have agency and we do have the power to advance and move forward human rights and civil rights and anti-racist agendas, efforts, paradigms. So I will say that one of the things that's been so interesting to watch is that, and I think I look back at even my own writing and I think, when I was saying something 10 years ago, like technology is a social practice, it's not just a tool, it's value-laden social practice that gets codified in different ways, and that there has to be an ethics of justice tied to the way that we think about these kinds of projects, because they transform society in so many different ways. And this is where I think back, I remember reading a million years ago when I was an undergrad in college, I remember reading Angela Davis writing about the dishwasher and how the dishwasher was supposed to be this new liberatory tool for women, right? And her feminist critique is that it didn't liberate us from washing dishes as women, right? It didn't liberate us in the domestic sphere of having to reproduce the labor market. What it did was raise the bar and make a higher standard of cleanliness that we all had to then adhere to. So it made more work for us, but people fancied it a tool. But it actually transformed social practice and, in fact, was part of a whole parcel of appliances and projects and consumerism that ensnared us even more. So I think that the reason why we have to kind of think about what these technologies are doing and how we talk about them is very, very important. Now, when we talked a decade ago about that there were values embedded into these projects, again, that was highly illegible except to a kind of a small community of people, activists and scholars who were thinking about that. Now that's a much more mainstream concept, so mainstream that we have IBM and Google declaring themselves ethical AI companies and running like Super Bowl ads for it. So this is exactly the process that Sasha is talking about, which is this kind of capture that happens. And I think this is part of what we're dealing with right now, is a moment of full-blown capture of this conversation and reincorporating it back into the interests of the power holders in society. So we're going to have to we need more vocabulary words. The words we used 10 years ago aren't the words we can use today, because now they've been distorted, they've been defanged, they've been depoliticized. Now what people are interested in doing is, and I see this with computer science students that come into my classroom at UCLA, they want to make better algorithms. They want to make better AI. They want to make ethical algorithms and ethical AI. And they're interested in the techno-solutionism rather than thinking about what does it mean that that this entire sector is so profoundly implicated in undermining the project of multiracial democracy that is barely underway, that putting more resources on computer programming at the same time that we defund education, we defund the media, we defund every kind of public good that would help us develop a critical awareness and ability to resist these kinds of technologies is happening. So we have to remain creative and agile, which I think people who are on the front lines of witnessing and experiencing the most harm are always thinking about ways to work ourselves out of those conditions. In fact, that is also a feature of oppression, is the impulse to be liberated from that oppression. And I completely agree that this is the energy that is actually going to take us forward. One of the things that I think we're way past now is this desire for ethical AI. I mean, many of us who might have said and tried to make legible that there are ethical concerns, there are concerns about injustice that are tied to the tech industry, are now really far away from that conversation and saying some of these technologies should be abolished. We should have an abolitionist stance toward many of these projects and companies. Also, there needs to be repair, there needs to be restoration. That's actually what is required now. And I think about this, if ExxonMobil has an oil spill and they damage the ocean, and all the living creatures of the ocean and the people, because the damage extends around the globe, they must be responsible and accountable for cleaning it up and for repair and restoration. And, we need that, times 1,000 or more when we think about the way in which so many of these technologies are used and are implicated in the wholesale datafication and predictive modeling that is about classifying every person and creature on the planet and creating pathways for opportunity for some and for closing opportunity for others, and fully normalizing that through opaque technologies and automation. And those are the stakes. That's what's happening. That is the moment we're living in. And I think this is the thing that, of course, I know the three of us, it keeps us up at night. And it is, so I will just say it is like about diagnosing, like, because the problem and the ground shifts too. So we do have to keep diagnosing, but in that diagnosis and documenting, we also find places of resistance and new language to describe the conditions and new ways of organizing and connecting and linking up and, reimagining. And, I have to say, one of the reasons why I think the tech sector has so little imagination, or its imagination is really about domination, a complete lack of regard for oppressed people around the world, like just a inability to cohere the work that they're doing for some people and some companies, is because they don't have a relationship to the lived experience of oppression too. And this is one of the reasons why at a very minimal level, people want to see more diversity in the companies, because that would be a site of resistance. It would be voices in the room to say, you can't do that. That's illegal. You're breaking about 10 different civil rights laws with your project, or this is going to create, wide scale harm. So going back to your original question, I mean, yes, of course, we need people in every room in the world, in every conversation, foregrounding the concerns about justice and fairness and equity and repair and restoration. And I think that it will be people in companies who will also create pressure in those conversations too, even if it's just to be whistleblowers or to be people who walk out and say, we're not going to put our labor and our intellect in service of those kinds of projects. That's important work too.
And I think this is so important to hold, because, so much of what you're talking about, when our ideas and our movements become cannibalized by surveillance capitalism and the need for restoration and repair after the harm that has been, conducted on our communities, it's so much about the language of trauma and the spirals of trauma, where we just see ourselves having to come from one violence to another. And I often think that some of what we need to do is to stop. I think we need to just pause and not just look at this moment in time, but be able to say, enough. We're not going to be able to put a Band-Aid on a cancer. What we need is time to envision the new. And I always think about, like, imagine if philanthropy funded as much money into a great imagining by the same people who are researching our demise to begin thinking about the solutions. Because when you think about something like Facebook, I mean, Facebook was started by these dudes in Harvard that wanted hot chicks. And, it's certainly not the cultural competencies that you need for an intergovernmental organization handling, democratic conversation around the world, but the people who saw the business potential of that was the CIA, right? And who was one of their first funders. And, cut to Cambridge Analytica and, Facebook disrupting, so many democracies around the world, and not a single penny was paid in terms of reparations. Right. And I think this is what is so critical, is that I think that we are so breathless from the violence. We are just so tapped in terms of just trying to get our communities out of the crises that we're in. We need time to be able to not only talk about the full scope of the harm, to then be able to demand the reparations that are required. Because this isn't just I need a mea culpa in front of a congressional hearing thing. This is more like $1 billion reparations fund to support democratic processes around the world. This is $1 billion fund that is about supporting innovations into new business models, into new developments around technology that can actually heal, that can actually create abolitionist futures versus digital authoritarianism. Yep. And especially when I think of, companies like Google and their ethical AI, I was like, why would I trust Google to build ethical AI when they couldn't keep Google Docs away out of the hands of the Indian government and turning over the IP of climate change activists who were protesting about farmers' rights? That is the most simplest task that they could do in order to not do evil, and yet they failed. So somehow, all of a sudden, there's going to be a moral compass that's going to come out of this in the face of the profit that is to be made around genocide.
Yeah.
And I think that's really the point, Sasha, I want to bring you in around this, is that we are dealing with situations like digital war, digital apartheid, when we look at what Palestinians are dealing with, and genocide. So again, I want to bring us back to, you talk a lot also about institutions not being monoliths. Where are the opportunities and where are the visioning processes that we could look at in both policy and processes?
Yeah, well, I definitely agree that it's hard to trust Google's ethical AI initiatives, especially after they've just finished firing Dr. Timnit Gebru and Meg Mitchell and the brilliant, Black women and other women leadership because they dared to publish their research findings about Google's AI systems and their ecological impacts and the ways that they reproduce existing biases in this stochastic pirates paper. So it's very difficult to look at what these firms are doing and not be deeply skeptical, and rightfully so, not to focus on the ethics washing as kind of, looks like that's what's actually taking place. At the same time, as a non-binary person, I like to complicate binary visions of what's happening. And so while I agree that there's great danger that the companies will capture the AI ethics conversation or the broader conversation about AI ethics, equitable AI, transparent AI, or algorithmic justice, I actually think that we can also see the fact that these companies all feel they need to create these teams as something very positive. I think they've been forced by a lot of different developments, including the increasing documentation of incidents of AI harm, by the great work of investigative journalism organizations like ProPublica, by the work of independent researchers coming from all different spaces, whether it's the work of Joy Bulamwini and Deb Baraji and Timnit Gebru in the gender shades work in actionable auditing, or it's the work of researchers outside the academy who are independently developing methods to audit these systems, or it's the work of researchers inside companies that are trying to figure out not only how to audit systems for technical bias, but also how to document harms that systems have created, and also develop tooling that will enable less biased outcomes, but also think about how we develop tooling for harms reporting, for incident reporting, learning from the cybersecurity industry, so that we could say, well, in cybersecurity, every time a known hack emerges and it's been exploited, that gets documented, it gets reported, it gets shared through a database that's shared across industry. There's standardization, there's incident reporting and escalation, and there's rapid response teams, and there's coordinated disclosure mechanisms where people have to patch those vulnerabilities quickly before the findings get published. Like, we can learn a lot from all of those sectors to actually build better systems. And while I agree with you, Safiya, that we need to make more careful determinations about which systems are carceral systems and should never be built, and which systems are systems worth building better. I completely agree with that. And I also completely agree that the companies want to capture the whole conversation. I also think that it provides a great opportunity in a lot of ways, because one, it means that there's now hundreds, if not thousands, of people, researchers, students who are just coming up, people who have just landed positions inside these organizations or have been doing this work for a long time, who are saying, finally, people are taking seriously the work we have been trying to do. And so there's networks of people that are emerging inside these companies that are at least having these conversations. They're in dialogue with one another, and they're also in dialogue with people outside the tech sector. They're in dialogue with social movements. I've been, in the last few months alone, I've been contacted by many researchers inside major multinational corporations that only in the last year, specifically because of the Black Lives Matter movement, have finally gotten approval from their higher ups to launch whole new initiatives around race and technology, not just in the diversity and inclusion in sort of employment space, which, yes, it's important, but we know it's not enough, but also in the product team, space. And I see those things as very, very positive developments, because imagining and then building the future, or the many futures that we might want, is going to take all different types of people and all different types of skills, and the degree to which the current moment we're living in terms of the pressure that social movements have created on these companies, and to some degree pressure that's starting to be generated in the regulatory space and from some of the bills that have been introduced or are moving through the US Congress or through the EU space, like the Algorithmic Justice Act that's just been brought in, or the Facial Recognition Moratorium and Biometric Surveillance Moratorium Act, or like the new EU regulations around algorithmic accountability that are in progress. Like, the combination of strong social movements demanding racial justice everywhere, including in the tech sector, as well as some regulatory action that's starting to move, is providing a window of opportunity for people who are working inside these companies to finally get resources and get the green light to move forward some very interesting projects, including around better tooling, better analysis, not only of technical bias auditing, which I think is important but is very limited, but also in terms of more radical revisioning of what it means to do harm reduction in the AI systems that we do need to develop, as well as to think about which are the systems we need to not say no to.
And I think that reminder is so important, because, again, I want to go back to how we started this conversation, which is that I think many people in this sector, and especially the human rights defenders and activists and researchers that are in the global South, they are coming to this conversation not with equity. They are coming with their hearts breaking. They're coming with their dead. And I think about in India, how devastated, almost all the institutions that work in this sector are by the pandemic. And to think about how in the face of such cataclysm that the burden of hope must feel like. And yet, I think that in many ways, hope is a muscle, hope is an exercise, hope is a practice. And I think a lot of what, both you and Safiya are really speaking to is that there are openings everywhere. And I think about, Tupac's book, The Rose That Grew from Concrete, in many ways, life always finds a way.
Right.
And that in this time of death, we are choosing to imagine because we are choosing life. And I've never felt such a profound need to choose life because I've already seen what the alternative is. I've already seen unspeakable things happen to my people. I've already seen people have to choose between eating or having the vaccine, or paying rent, or getting remdesivir, because the intellectual property patents related to the vaccines that we paid for as American citizens are being charged to countries like India. So
Right.
the ideas that we're talking about in terms of transformative policy, transformative business models, transformative technology, we need investment in terms of a great imagining. And when I think of that work that Joanna Macy does around the climate crisis and thinking about the invitation to use this moment as the great turning to ask for the world that can come afterwards, this is what we need in this space right now. We need care, we need love, we need healing, we need transformation, and imagination allows us to do that. But that doesn't happen when people are hungry, when people are in hiding, when people aren't able to even do their work safely. And that's unfortunately many of the activists that are part of the RightsCon space. Like, part of the reasons why I can't do a land acknowledgement is I don't want to reveal where I'm located because of the amount of death threats and rape threats that I receive as a Dalit activist, and the virulence of digital authoritarianism and digital Brahmanism. And I think that, Safiya, I think, we're coming to the closing part of our conversation. I think people look to your writing as a Black feminist scholar and as someone who has brought so much internationalism into this conversation for that engine of hope.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you could leave people with just a final thought about that before we close.
I closed my book with thinking about how could we imagine things differently? Because I completely agree with you that we deserve to get to live lives that are not completely constructed through trauma and oppression, where the only way we kind of understand ourselves is through those lenses, or that our entire life and our community's lives are not defined by. And this is one of the things where, I love being Black, because even in the face of what Black people experience all around the world, we have so much love and culture and community and connection and flavor and all the things that make life worth living too. And so that's a thing that we all have that. I mean, this is why, I roll with the kind of communities that I roll with, which are communities that also are like, Black communities, people who also have the texture of understanding oppression and finding joy and working through those things, through those conditions. So that's incredibly important. And, I think that we don't want to forget that the conditions that we're living through right now that you are talking about are tied to the profoundly immoral and gross distribution of resources in the world. This is fundamental to me. I really don't care about the technology. I care about the way in which the technology sector defunds the possibilities that you're talking about of having affordable housing, of having affordable food, of having dignity in our work, of living in worlds where discrimination and oppression are not normal and expected. You should not be experiencing death threats for speaking truth to power. right? We should not be living in that kind of a world where just naming the most obvious of gross injustices um, generates those types of conditions, right? Those types of threats. So this is why, to me, that's what I feel the most hopeful about, is that we are increasingly linking the fantasy about what technology can do, what these systems can do, to the real world implications of what they are not doing. And in fact, the gross investment of resources in one sector that will privilege such a small minority of people in the world and will be used to organize more efficiently the demise of others, those are the questions to me that we need to be thinking about. That's actually the point of studying this sector and caring about it, is not for the tech, it's for the people, it's for the planet, it's for the quality of life that we want to live, and where we need to put the brakes on systems that will impede upon people living full, powerful, amazing, full lives. It's not that we don't have enough resources in the world. We have all the resources. It's just that most of them are concentrated in the hands of a tiny few. That's actually the challenge. And I will say that, to your point, your opening salvo here, it is the caste systems, it is the colorism, it is the oppression, it is the anti-blackness, it is the homophobic, transphobic, it is the patriarchal, anti-earth sentiments and sensibilities that are really about the individual and what the individual should have, to the detriment of the collective. That, those are the values underneath this that we need to be challenging. And to me, part of the problem is that the tech sector really socializes us to individual hyper-consumptive kinds of ways of thinking in the world. And that's part of what we're resisting. And so I feel incredibly hopeful because, nobody wants to live a life in the United States of just tapping on glass the rest of their lives, losing the ability to be creative and do work. But also, people don't want to mine the minerals that it takes to make this stuff, or have to sift through the e-waste and the toxicity of it when we're done with it. We have a responsibility, especially in the United States, to understand our role, especially as consumers, in relationship to these global problems. And I think that, that we have space to talk about it is incredibly important. And I agree. Who's going to give us $1 billion to go off into the woods and imagine the futures that we want, like all the tech executives get? And the world that they've imagined for us is not a world we want. I don't think, in the end, if we follow the logics that they've envisioned for us, it's not the world we want. And so we absolutely have to invest in other kinds of imaginaries.
Yeah, I think that
I would like to volunteer for listening that, Safiya, Sasha, and I would be more than happy to be able to support that, support the hosting of such a fund, to be able to help make that happen, particularly because I think this moment is about lots of experimentation. Because it may not be that someone's going to have the big picture answer, but what we actually need is time for people to be able to heal through experimentation and to be able to know that there's growth. How did that rose grow from concrete? It was first a little shoot. And imagine if there was tons of little shoots like that, tons of little revolutionary possibilities that people that are coming out of digital apartheid, that are coming from surveillance capitalism, that are coming from, digital Brahmanism. Imagining this world where we are centered, not capital. And Sasha, I'm just wondering if you can kind of bring us home for people that, may have started to feel overwhelmed when we started, but now see a little opening and see a little possibility. How else might we open people's hearts at this time?
Well, I guess I'll just close by saying, it's Pride Month, and as a trans person who's written about sort of my interactions in a trans body with airport security systems and the way that they're designed to reproduce cis normativity, or the assumption that everybody identifies with the same gender they're assigned at birth, and the way that technical systems just sort of break when they attempt to reduce the dramatic and beautiful diversity of human bodies and experiences into limited binary categories. It gives me a lot of hope when I look at how, despite hundreds of years of settler colonial violence that systematically attempted to eliminate, destroy, dismember, and kill third gender and non-binary peoples in everywhere around the world that the colonizers went, that did not work because people are not like that. And so there continues to be a beautiful diversity of human bodies and genders and experiences of many, many different kinds. And the reductive categorization that so much of the tech sector is deeply invested in reproducing fails against the brilliance of human experience and histories and trajectories. So we cannot be contained, we cannot be boxed, and expect us. No, I'm just saying there are many worlds and they're all sort of struggling to be born. And the one that the masters of tech and the world's billionaires who pay no taxes, as ProPublica just demonstrated, their vision is only one vision among billions. And I have hope and faith that with organizing and solidarity and with accomplices of many kinds in many directions, we'll build some of those other worlds.
So I just want to thank you for those closing thoughts and for all the people that joined us. We are here, even in this conversation, building that other world. And so we just want to encourage you all to know that there's still hope. Know that we're building hope through experimentations and relationships and dreaming. And to thank everyone who's showing up in these hard times, and know that we see you, we hear you, we are part of one community, and we will win. So thank you. And thank you, RightsCon, for hosting this really powerful conversation. Jai Bhim and Jai Savitri.